Thank you and welcome to the show this morning. The topic this morning is Malcolm X, and we're fortunate to have with us to talk about Malcolm X and related matters the chairperson of the Africana Studies Department at Tennessee State University, Dr. AAl-Hadid. And of course, Dr. Al-Hadid, let me welcome you to the show this morning.
Thank you, Dr. Haynes. It's always a pleasure to be with you.
And Dr. Al-Hadid, what can we say in reference to what you've already given us? Everything from Marcus Garvey to Africans in the New World, historical black colleges, just a whole number of just very interesting and important pieces of information. And we know that what you will give us today in reference to Malcolm X will equal any of that you've already given us. And so let's start off by perhaps having you to talk about your background, your education, and some of the things that you've been involved in for those few members of our audience who might not have had an opportunity to see any of the 12 or 13 different shows that you've given us. So let's start off and then we'll talk about Malcolm X.
Well, first of all, I was born in Montgomery, Alabama. I went to George Washington High School and Alabama State University, where I received a bachelor's of sociology and also had a strong emphasis in psychology. I left the Deep South and went out on the West Coast to California, where I received a doctorate in sociology at the University of California in Santa Barbara. While studying there as a graduate student, I had an opportunity to go to Nairobi, Kenya. And it was there in Nairobi, Kenya in 1969 that I converted to the religion of Islam. And I also made the pilgrimage 6 months later, went to Mecca. Much of this was influenced by reading the autobiography of Malcolm X. So after I got my worldview and my formal education together, I then started looking for a job.
Okay.
And then, of course, I interviewed at Tennessee State University, Fisk, Meharry, and a few other places, and I settled on Tennessee State University. Been at TSU for a long time. I started in the sociology department. Then in 1994, we created the Department of Africana Studies. And since 1994, I have served for the last 13 years as chair of the Department of Africana Studies, Tennessee State University.
Very good. You know, Dr. Al-Hadid, when we talk about Malcolm X, I think that many people, and especially younger people, might not understand exactly who this individual was. And what we'd like to do today is for you to not only talk about Malcolm X, but to give us a little background information in reference to who he was and other information that you think that we ought to be interested in.
Well, as I said earlier, my interest in Malcolm started by reading the autobiography of Malcolm X. I think I must have read it about 7 times. And that was what inspired me, you know, to become a Muslim. In terms of Malcolm, here's a man born 1925 in Omaha, Nebraska, in the Midwest, just before the Great Depression. And then as a result of that, you know, his parents were followers of Marcus Garvey. We've talked about Garvey in an earlier show. And while he was growing up there in Omaha, Nebraska, because of the advocacy of his father, the family was often attacked by the Ku Klux Klan. And so when we get to, say, 1931, he's about 6 years old. Some say he was in kindergarten, maybe, you know, first grade. His father was killed, assassinated by the Klan. And he and his father were very close, and obviously that had a very traumatic effect on him. And then as he grew older and went to the 7th or 8th grade, around age 14, his mother had a nervous breakdown, and then she was committed to the Kalamazoo Mental Hospital in Kalamazoo, Michigan. And at that time, he just started losing all interest in school. He dropped out. He was committed to a number of foster homes and juvenile detention homes. So I think that was the thing that started him to drift into a world of juvenile delinquency. His oldest sister, by his father's first wife, Daisy Mae Little, saw him and then decided to take him from Michigan to Boston, where he went to Roxborough, which is like the black, you know, suburban area of Boston. And from that point, that was when he started to go into the world of crime. I think it's important that maybe we should tell the audience who Malcolm's father was.
Yeah.
His father's name was Reverend Earl Little, and his mother was Louisa Little, who was from Grenada. Okay, and so this older sister, by the first marriage, kept reminding him of the father and the commitment to the philosopher Marcus Garvey. Now, the thing that tipped the scale for Malcolm, of course, his father's killed by the Klan when he's 6 years old. His mother's committed to a mental institution by age 14. And the thing that tipped the scale in terms of him leaving grade school was that he told his teacher that he wanted to be a lawyer.
Let's break here for this first commercial break, Doctor, and then we'll pick up at this particular point. So we'll be back with you following this short commercial break. Thank you, and welcome back to the second segment of the show for today. We're talking to Dr. Al-Hadid, the chairperson of the Africana Studies Department at Tennessee State University, and the topic is Malcolm X. Doctor, let's continue that conversation that I so abruptly interrupted during our first segment here. Let's continue that.
Well, our subject here is Malcolm Little. That was his name. And so when he went to Boston, that's when he sort of got involved in crime. Then, of course, he went to New York, where he really got involved in the underworld. And he became a thief. He had a burglary ring. He also was a pimp, a hustler. And so finally, in 1946, he got arrested and was sentenced to prison for 10 years. He actually served 6.5 years of his prison term. But while in prison in Massachusetts, he was visited by some members of his family, and they started telling him about the Nation of Islam. And about Elijah Muhammad and Master Farad Muhammad. And so because of the experiences he had had with crime and also his background growing up within the Marcus Garvey family, he started to listen. But now at first he wasn't too much interested in religion. So when his brother approached him, he told him that, Malcolm, I know a way that you can get out of prison. And so he just thought it was as being a hustler, he thought it was some kind of scam. So he told him to stop eating pork, stop smoking cigarettes, and stop using profanity. And he said, that's all? He said, yeah, that's all you need to do. And so he didn't know at the time that he was being preconditioned for a religious conversion. And so he stopped doing that, and people started looking at him differently. And so over time, he became a model prisoner. And also he started to study the teachings of the Nation of Islam. When he was told that the white man was the devil, which he had no problem in believing, because after all, his father had been killed by the white folks, the Klan. He had 2 uncles or 3 uncles that had been killed by the Klan. His mother had been committed to an insane asylum by white folks. And also the fact that when he was arrested, he was involved with 2 white women, and they were used as sort of go-betweens. They would go to homes, case the homes, and then report back to him. And then he and his associates would go and break in the home when the family wasn't at home. So he put, 1 and 1 equals 2. He figured it all out. Well, these are the people that are responsible for me being in prison, so I know they got to be devils. But one thing that he never could digest was that the white man was, that the black man rather was God. He couldn't quite fathom that in his mind, but he did readily accept the fact that the white man was the devil. So when he got out of prison in 1952, then he went to Detroit with his brother. He was on parole because he only served 6.5 years out of the 10-year sentence that he was given. So once he met Elijah Muhammad started to teach him. So in a very short period of time, I'd say about 2 years, he became the minister of the temple in Harlem, Temple number 7. And shortly after that, he became the national spokesperson for the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. Now, at the time that he received these teachings of Islam, he did not know, did not realize that these teachings were not exactly what Islam was all about. And in order to show the difference, let me just tell the audience what true Islam is. Well, first of all, Islam means total submission to the will of Allah. A person who accepts this becomes a Muslim. The proper name for God is Allah, and the holy text of the Muslims is the Quran. And there are 5 basic beliefs that you must have. First of all, that there's no God but Allah, and Muhammad is last and final messenger. You must also pray 5 times a day, give 2.5% of your wealth in charity, and then you should also fast during the month of Ramadan. And as fate would have it, we are now trying to sight the new moon to begin the fasting of Ramadan at this very moment. Ramadan here will start either Saturday or Sunday. Then finally, we have the pilgrimage to Mecca, which comes in the last month of the Islamic calendar, which is the month of Hajj. And that was the thing that when Malcolm made the pilgrimage to Mecca, that allowed him to see clearly the difference between the type of Islam he was taught and Islam that he eventually came to accept as true Islam or mainstream Islam. But as things developed, Malcolm became very popular. As a matter of fact, as early as 1958, he traveled abroad to Sudan, to Egypt, and to Turkey, and he had a chance to see true Islam as early as 1958. So when he came back, he had a different kind of perspective on Islam in contrast to what he had been taught by the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. So as things kept unraveling, people inside of the Nation of Islam became somewhat jealous of him. And they started taking his articles out of the Muhammad Speaks newspaper. And, you know, the jealousy and animosity started to develop. So eventually, they tried to figure out some way to get him out of the Nation of Islam. And the incident that he used as a pretext of getting him out of the Nation of Islam was when President John F. Kennedy was assassinated on November 22nd, 1963. Elijah Muhammad sent an executive order for none of his ministers to say anything about the incident. So Malcolm, after giving a speech, inadvertently said that the assassination of Kennedy was a case of the chickens coming home to roost. And what did he want to say that?
I remember that statement. I remember.
He made that statement, and then initially he was suspended from the Nation of Islam for 90 days. But he eventually realized that he was not going to be admitted back into the Nation of Islam. So he then went to the Islamic Center in Brooklyn, New York, and there at the Islamic Center, he became a true and proper Muslim. And once he converted in 1964, he then made arrangements to go to Mecca so that he could really see the entire Muslim world and travel throughout the Muslim world. And so the Malcolm that left the Nation of Islam in 1964, around March of 64, and the one that went to Mecca in April of 1964 was totally different from the Malcolm X that developed in terms of after his pilgrimage to Mecca in 1964.
Very good. And I tell you, I think that this might be a good point to stop for this second commercial break, after which we can come back and then you can sort of give us the information relative to the assassination and really the legacy. I think you gave us a lot of information dealing with the legacy of Marcus Garvey. And I'm sure that Malcolm has, certainly his legacy might not be as great as Marcus Garvey's legacy, but certainly he, and I'm sure that you have a lot of information in reference to that legacy. And of course, let us take this second commercial break, and we'll be back with our audience following this second commercial break. Thank you and welcome back to this final segment of the show for today. The topic is Malcolm X. The guest is Dr. AAl-Hadid, the chairperson of Africana Studies at Tennessee State University. And of course, Doctor, before we had our break, you promised that you would give us some information relative to Malcolm outside of the nation. And of course, we'll give you an opportunity to do that now.
Yeah, the Malcolm outside of the Nation of Islam was a new man, totally transformed. He didn't continue to spout racist rhetoric. He was a person who was actually moving a lot closer to Martin Luther King. As a matter of fact, in February of 1965, just before his assassination, he'd actually gone to Selma, Alabama in order to form a coalition of conscience with Martin Luther King. Unfortunately, at the time, Dr. King was in jail, but he did take counsel with his wife, Coretta Scott King, Andrew Young, Bernard Lafayette, as well as John Lewis. And he was trying to say that he made some mistakes when he was inside of the Nation of Islam, and he understood that Martin Luther King's strategy of freedom, justice, and equality was the best way for our people to go. So he wanted to take the civil rights struggle from the level of civil rights to the level of human rights. And rather than trying to lodge our case with the United States Supreme Court, he wanted to make an argument for human rights before the United Nations and the World Court, because he actually saw, you know, today, for example, we hear people talking about genocide going on in the Sudan or other parts of the world. In 1964 and 65, Malcolm was saying that the white supremacist government of this country, the white supremacists in this country were actually committing acts of genocide against African Americans. So he was making the case for genocide and also making the case for human rights. And he was trying to get a buy-in from Dr. King in order to move in that direction. And you have to remember now, both Dr. King and Malcolm had gone outside of this country in 1964. Malcolm made the pilgrimage in April of '64, and Dr. King got the Nobel Peace Prize in December of 1964. So when both of these men came back inside of the United States in 1964, they had shifted from a race-based analysis of the problem to more or less a class analysis and also an international analysis. You remember Dr. King was talking about voting rights. He was also talking about, he started to move against the war in Vietnam. And Malcolm had already been there some years early, even when he was in the Nation of Islam. So they both started to deal more with human rights issues. They both started to deal with international issues, being opposed to the war in Vietnam, being opposed to the apartheid government in South Africa. And it looked as though the two men were starting to come together. As a matter of fact, he was assassinated on February 21st, 1965, which was on a Sunday at 3 o'clock. That following Tuesday, he was supposed to meet with Martin Luther King at the home of Sidney Poitier. They were supposed to come together and have a discussion about how Malcolm could get on board with the civil rights movement and take it to the next level. Because there's no doubt that Malcolm completely dominated the ghettos of the North, and also some of the ghettos on the West Coast like Los Angeles, San Francisco, and so forth. King completely dominated the southern region. So the leaders, these two leaders, one being the champion of the blacks in the inner cities of the North, and the other one being the champion of the working class in the South, as well as the peasants, the sharecroppers in the South, in Alabama, and Mississippi, and Arkansas. So had those two men come together in 1965, the kind of problems that we're looking at now would probably not be in existence, because those two men, I think, working in tandem, working together, would have been the type of unity that we needed on the international front as well as the local scene.
You know, you spoke earlier about Dr. King and Malcolm, and I think that at one time you indicated that Malcolm and King sort of play the same role in a real sense, and they were both disliked intensely by J. Edgar Hoover. Touch upon that. I mean, what was Malcolm's relationship with Mr. Hoover, and why? And I think that there's even some suggestion that the government might have had something to do with his assassination, even though the government itself did not assassinate him. He was, from what I understand, he was assassinated by members of the Nation of Islam's organization. But speak to that.
Yeah, that was a myth, I think, and I would want to call it a myth that was sort of operating inside of the intelligence community in this country at that time. And much of it had to do with the fact that we were in the Cold War, you know, the communism versus the Western so-called democracies. And so J. Edgar Hoover had this idea that he wanted to stop the rise of a Messiah, almost like Pharaoh during the times of Moses. And he did see Dr. King and Malcolm as the possibility of being that Messiah that would rise up among the African Americans and free them from the bondage of modern-day Pharaoh. And so that was the mythology that J. Edgar Hoover operated out. And I would think that even to this very day, there's still that paranoia that somehow the Most High will come with divine intervention and raise up another Messiah in our midst who will free us from that type of oppression. But that was the type of mythology that was operating that time period. And also the fact that just before Malcolm and Martin, you know, you had Paul Robeson and W.E.B. Du Bois who had declared themselves as communists.
Oh, good.
And they had traveled to the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. So there was a possibility that they too would make those links with the communist faction outside of this country. So the Cold War played a major role in how the civil rights movement. As a matter of fact, there were people in King's movement that had to leave the movement because people thought that they were communists. Martin Luther King in the early 50s was accused of being a communist, you know. So I think that was the kind of idea that J. Edgar Hoover was operating from, this fear of communism rising up in the form of a black messiah among African Americans.
Now, what is the legacy of of Malcolm X?
Sure.
I mean, what role do you think that he continues to play in our society today?
In my judgment, I think the legacy of, as I would call him, AAl-Hadid17, because when he made the pilgrimage to Mecca, he changed his name. I think that when you look at the year 1965, this was a very powerful year. This is a year that Malcolm made the pilgrimage to Mecca. This is a year that Dr. King did the Selma to Montgomery March in terms of the Voting Rights Act. But he was effective in linking the Muslim world with African American Muslims in this country. He was also effective in linking the African continent with the struggle inside of this country. So as a spokesperson for Pan-Africanism and also a spokesperson for Muslims all over the world, I think he was very effective in making that link. And then once he made that link of American Muslims in general and African Americans in particular with the Muslim world, it was at that time that immigrant Muslims started to gain more confidence. In fact, they started forming their association like the Muslim Student Association and other organizations. And then, of course, in '65, immigration policies changed and more people were allowed to come in this country from Muslim countries like in the Middle East and Turkey. And so eventually the immigrant Muslims started to stand up and advocate Islam. When they first came in this country after the First World War, which was a collapse of the Ottoman Empire, they were told specifically, it's all right for you to come to this country, but don't have any conversation about Islam. Just come in here, be quiet, practice Islam among fellow immigrant Muslims, but do not try to convert African Americans to Islam. They told them specifically not to try to convert African Americans to Islam because they knew that when African Americans came to this country from Africa, and many of them, I would say as many as 50% of them were Muslims already, who were part of the Moorish Empire as well as the Songhai Empire, and they wanted to remind these African American Muslims that before they came over here, they were Muslims. And then when they came over here, the ordeal of the plantation put them in a situation where they no longer had knowledge of their Islamic background. And so that was the reason that immigration and the State Department tried to keep immigrant Muslims away from African American Muslims.
And so there's a long legacy of Malcolm, and even though he and Dr. King are no longer with us, that their ideas and their aspirations for African Americans continue to exist. Would you say that?
Yeah, I think after the Spike Lee's movie, there was a resurgence of an interest in Malcolm X, and that's why I'm trying to get my book together, which will loosely be entitled AAl-Hadid17 Muslim and Pan-African State.